Hello, everyone, and welcome to Relic Law's Interview with an Expert series. I'm William Orlowitz, Principal Attorney at Relic Law. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Robert Fowler, who is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Extero, and he will be answering our questions on operationalizing privacy compliance at scale. So, Robert, just to jump right in, can you give us a little bit of background about yourself and about Extero?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Will, for giving us this opportunity to chat today. We're excited to have this discussion. So a little background on Extero. So Extero is the leading provider of e-discovery and data privacy software, and it's specifically designed for in-house legal, privacy, and IT teams at Global 2000 and AmLaw 200 organizations. And our platform is really built on a simple concept of process optimization. So, Extero helps organizations address their regulatory, compliance, litigation risks, and we help them do that more effectively and at lower costs. Also worth to mention that Extero is the exclusive ACC alliance partner for data privacy and e-discovery. So for those of you who are familiar with the Association of Corporate Counsel, we are the exclusive alliance partner with that organization. And then about myself, so I've been with this business for the last 15 years. I'm a certified information privacy professional, and I have a unique background in that I've worked really closely with legal, IT, compliance, as well as privacy professionals, and including their outside counsel to help their companies manage their information more compliantly, defensibly, and cost effectively. So I'm excited to share some of my experience and insight with everyone today.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's excellent. I think this is a really relevant topic, given a lot of the changes that are taking place in the privacy landscape. And I think that really leads us into our first question, which are, why are traditional tools like spreadsheets giving way to more enterprise-style platforms for companies to manage their privacy compliance?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I can tell you that having been in this industry for a while, we really feel as though we kind of pioneered the data inventory, because for 30 years we've been helping companies manage information from a records retention perspective, right? And that was always how you would develop a retention program. You'd have to go out and understand, what do you have and where do you have it. And many years ago, it was fine to try to compile that with a spreadsheet. And I can tell you that, over the last few years, especially as we've seen privacy regulations like GDPR come into play and CCPA, what we have seen is really a shift in that organizations are realizing that it's just no longer feasible to develop an inventory with spreadsheets or PDFs or all these different sorts of diagrams, and it's really hard to keep those up to date and maintain them. So what we've seen is that it's a real time intensive process. They're generally very difficult, if not impossible, to keep up to date. And if you look at regulations like GDPR, for instance, it says, look, you have to keep this up to date. I think we're going to see more of that here in the U.S. as well. And so, what we have seen is really a shift for organizations to say, look, we need to manage this in a more dynamic way. We need the ability to create an inventory and really treat it as an evergreen document or evergreen process, meaning it's going to ebb and flow as our business changes, and it's also going to ebb and flow and be modified as new privacy regulations come on. And so, that has really been a sea change in the way that businesses are tackling this. And I can tell you, we've seen everything under the sun with data inventories that were, compiled using Excel. And one of the other really big challenges is just there's a lot of inconsistency in the responses. So if you think about asking business people these sorts of questions about their data, everybody might answer it a little bit differently or provide kind of a different twist to a response. And so, creating an inventory with some real standardization in the responses is really critical too. So I think the final thing, just what we are seeing in the market is that, businesses are saying the inventory is important because of other reasons. Things like it would be helpful to know where my data is if I receive a data subject access request. Or I've seen examples where clients have had a data breach and they've gone back and leveraged their inventory to help them more quickly understand the scope of the breach and where things might be located. And then obviously for e-discovery reasons and things of that nature. But we really see the inventory as kind of the ground floor of the program, and it needs to be in a format that can be modified. And that's where leveraging some technology and a platform really makes a lot of sense for most companies.
Yeah, and I think we see that as well in our practice. I think those are germane issues where, I always struggle with helping the client maintain consistency sort of in the record keeping, version controlling those records, and then also kind of managing the access to that information across the company. And, having a tool in place that does that in a systematic way, I think is very useful. And I think that really takes us into the next question, which is, how does an organization to begin with, just to discover and identify the regulated data in its environment?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's kind of the key, right? I mean, that's why we're doing this. We're trying to understand what data do we have that is either a risk to the business, that we're maintaining it in a way that is a risk to the business, or that is regulated or governed by a law or privacy regulation. And so, I think it goes without saying that the first step is obviously you have to go through the process of creating an inventory, right? You have to interact with people and understand what do we have and where do we have it and why do we have it. But more than that, you have to understand the types of data that your business considers to be sensitive or personal. And while, when you look at regulations like a CCPA, for instance, and it lays out, here are the types of data that, we deem to be considered personal, of course you want to understand, where you're maintaining that if CCPA applies to you. But also there's, a lot of, every business is a little bit different, right? And you maintain data that might be considered risky to your business or more risky to yours than maybe to someone else. And so understanding, what data, for instance, if you're a business that has operations in Illinois, and there's the, BIPA, the biometric law in the state of Illinois, do you know where your biometric data is? And those are all things that really, what we have seen to be really successful with our clients is kind of almost a two-pronged approach, right? It's kind of sitting down with either your in-house legal team or your outside counsel, and sitting down and really saying, okay, what are the types of data that we need to uncover? What are the types of things that we need to know about? And then leveraging some technology like a data inventory service to really go out and say, okay, here's the kinds of things we care about and we need to understand. Let's talk to the business people now and have them help us understand where we have these, and how we're maintaining them. And so that's been a really popular approach, and one that has really, provided some really great benefits to our clients because they feel comfortable that because they've worked with outside counsel, or in-house, but they've really identified the right things to go look for. Then they feel really confident going out and interviewing the business and gathering that detail.
Yeah, and I would tend to agree. I think one of the biggest challenges coming into new engagements as counsel, where our role is, isn't in an advisory capacity. It's how do we identify the information that they have or that they're collecting that is subject to regulation, and the discovery process of being able to do that in a way that gives us, some quick access to that information, I think is really useful and helps define the path forward for that particular client. So, in the next step, I mean, how should a data inventory be, created, organized, and maintained?
Yeah. So, we've talked a little bit about this, today about, kind of the old school method of trying to sit down with business people and pulling up a spreadsheet and going through it from that process. And we're really just seeing across the board the market saying, yeah, that's not an effective approach. And so, a couple of things. I think, first of all, we always recommend, look, you have to talk to business people. At the end of the day, they are the folks who understand what they have. They understand how they use it, where it lives. And so by no means are we saying you need to turn the business upside down and go through lengthy interviews with every single business person. No, I mean, that's not practical. Honestly, the return on that would not be worth the time and effort. So our recommendation is you want to identify one or two business people from each business function that you have, right? So a couple folks from HR and legal, finance, tax, however you're structured. And you want to do that too. If you're a global organization, you want to make sure you're speaking to people in your global locations as well. And so really pinpointing, who are the right folks, who are the people that I could talk to within a business area that have a good working knowledge of the kind of data that they use. And granted, you're not going to find, the perfect person 100% of the time, but there are folks in every business area that have a pretty good feel for that. And so from our perspective, when we're working with clients on this process and when they're leveraging technology, these inventories take anywhere from 30 to 45 days. And so it's a really quick, pretty efficient process. And generally, when you're going about it with this approach, you're looking to ask business people to spend about 60 or 90 minutes going through this really structured profiling process where we're saying, what sort of processing activities do you work with in your business area? What sort of records do you work with? Where do you keep them? What applications and vendors and all of that, right? So you're gathering this information, but you're talking to those folks that can really answer those questions. And so with their input, you then want to be able to maintain this inventory, right? Because one of the things that we are always communicating to clients and prospective clients is this is not a one and done effort. It used to be. Back in the day, it felt a little bit more like, okay, we could do an inventory and that'll help us maybe develop a retention schedule, and then we can kind of move on and check the box. And it's not the world we live in today. With data privacy regulations, this is something that has to be maintained. And so you want to maintain it in a system, in a platform with some technology that allows you to go back out a year from now and kind of check in with the business people and say, what has changed? Hey, there's a new privacy regulation in the state of Texas or New York, or you name it. We need to make sure we're identifying the personal sorts of data and categories for those regulations. So that's really important. And then finally, just it's critical to understand the impact that the data inventory has, again, on your data subject access request process. So that's always where we start when we're really trying to go out and fulfill those requests, is like, we have to go out and find this data. So it'd be really nice to have a map of where that is. And of course, as organizations change and ebb and flow, that data inventory is going to change. And then so will where you're going to find that data for those requests. So, those are really the key things. I think it's keeping it in a format that's updatable, and really leveraging technology to help you move through that process really efficiently.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue into our next question, where, let's fast forward and presume that the organization has discovered all the information in their environment that they need to address, and they've built that data inventory. How can they then, leverage the platform to operationalize, the burden of processing privacy requests?
Yeah, it's an important question because we've seen statistics like from the analyst firm Gartner. They estimate that a single data subject access request can cost $1,400 and can take a full working week to respond to each request. And under regulations like CCPA, you only have 45 days to respond. And in fact, we have a client who, prior to CCPA becoming live, had already received 15,000 requests, and many of those were due to GDPR. But do the math on that. $1,400 for a request. You're getting a lot of those, and the time and the cost that it takes to fulfill them. So, from the perspective of data subject access requests, these are the things we think that are important to understand about what constitutes a good process. So, first you have to have the ability for the individual to make the request, right? So you need a web page or some way for them to say, hey, my name is Robert, I'm a California resident, I would like for you to delete all my data, or I want you to provide all my data. You have to be able to authenticate that Robert is who he says he is. The last thing you want to do is go through this process of giving all of Robert's data to Will. now you have a data breach on your hands. And so authentication is really critical. And how do you do that and do it efficiently? Making sure you have some workflows to route these requests. I wish I could say that they were all very simple and they're all going to come from the same, person who lives in California and has the same request, but they're not. They're going to come from a lot of different people in a lot of different locations with many different requests, and you're going to have to treat them all uniquely. And so having workflows is really critical. And from there, once you actually start diving into the request, now you need to be able to identify the data that's relevant to the request for that individual. And then you have to go out and collect it, review it, redact it, and provide it back to them in a secure manner. And those words, when I say those words, they sound very e-discovery to a lot of people. And it's very similar to that process, right? You're having to go out and find this information. And so from there, that is a process unto itself, and making sure that you're doing that efficiently. And that's where we see a lot of the time, that it's taking businesses to do that. And then finally, you have to have the ability to do multiple, sorts of things with it, right? You might have to delete it for one, remediate it for another, deliver it for another. So those are really, the things we think about in a process. And then I think 3 just kind of simple keys to help businesses with DSAR requests is things like have less data, right? So minimize what you don't need to have so you don't have to go through and collect it. Know where your data is, right? Have an inventory, know where you need to go to find this information. And then as we've been talking today, right, we feel strongly that there's a role for technology to play in really tying all of that together and creating an efficient and defensible process.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think highlighting all of those steps individually really does provide businesses with a better understanding of what really goes into responding to a DSAR. It's easy to look at a regulation and say, oh, if we get a request, we just have to process the request. Well, break down that word process and unpack it and see what's actually inside of it. And you realize that it's a little bit more of a complex activity than maybe at first blush it seems to be. So moving on to question 5, how can an organization minimize data and maintain sort of a defensible evidence of their compliance in case there is a regulatory investigation or some kind of a complaint filed against them?
Yeah, we see data minimization as kind of the holy grail to mitigating data privacy risks. And we look at it through the lens of really there's 3 main reasons why having less data is a good thing for your business. We look at it through the lens of litigation, which I think, everybody kind of knows is a risk, but then, data privacy and data breach. And so when you look at, litigation, for instance, document review, there's a study out that says that it's 73% of the cost of litigation is just reviewing documents. So our business was built many years ago, helping companies really say, look, if you'd like to not go through a terrible experience like that litigation again, have less stuff and there will be less to review, the costs go down. Those are all good things. And so that is always going to be a help. And then you look at too, from a litigation perspective, you have CCPA's private right of action. And the plaintiff's bar is really weaponizing this regulation in some instances. And there's likely a wave of litigation heading our way, and we're starting to see some of that already, right? So litigation is one piece. Data privacy, this statistic kind of blows my mind in a way. A study recently showed that 75% of over-retained data within businesses contains personal data. And so if you think about if the name of the game today is understanding where your personal data is and protecting it, having less of it is a good thing for your business. And so minimizing it would definitely be moving you in the right direction. And then finally, data breach, right? So I think this goes without saying, but if you're over retaining data that you really don't need or shouldn't have in the first place, there's a risk there that if you do have a breach, that data could become compromised, right? And obviously that's something nobody wants to have happen. The FTC has a really good saying that we kind of like to share, and they talk about, data that you don't have can't be breached. You don't have to protect data that you don't have, and you don't have to spend time and money searching for and producing data you don't have, right? For like a data subject access request, and those are all good things. So, data minimization, it starts with, you have to know your data. So it starts with your inventory. You have to develop a retention schedule and a policy. You need to communicate that, train people. It needs to become kind of their everyday, it just kind of becomes part of their business process, and then repeat it. But we really think that for organizations who are serious about mitigating and reducing the risks associated with those things, this is a really good place to start and can really reap just a lot of benefits for any business.
Definitely. And I think, a lot of companies find it easy or finding it easier to at least talk about risk management with respect to personal information and data privacy obligations. But I think that taking the actual step of implementing new processes or techniques or methods of reducing that risk is the much more difficult part. And so I think the things you mentioned are very relevant to a lot of companies and the discussions they're having internally between, their own risk management and compliance teams and their IT departments. So let's take a look at the last question here, which is, what tools can an organization deploy to actually ensure that its vendors are also staying in compliance? Because that's another area of exposure that doesn't maybe get enough attention. But a lot of the even marquee data breaches and sort of large issues that have arisen recently have actually come indirectly through vendors and have impacted larger companies. And so I know it's an area that people are concerned about.
Yeah, you make a really good point. And, you're right. Vendors are a tremendous risk to businesses, and one that, as you mentioned, I think it's swept under the rug sometimes, or at least not enough attention is being paid to it. A recent Ponymon study showed that 61% of data breaches are caused by third parties. So kind of to your point there, Will, I mean, it's a major problem. And so if you think about, gosh, almost 2 out of every 3 data breaches today are caused by third parties, I think that it should send a signal to, businesses and organizations to say, okay, well, we should dive into that a little bit. Who are our third parties? Who are our vendors? Who do we do business with? Who has access to our data? That is really a critical thing, I think, to, again, help businesses mitigate some of this risk. So when we're helping our clients around vendor risk, there's really 5 questions or 5 items that we start with that we think are critical. So first, who are our vendors? And that might sound like kind of a silly question, like, oh, Robert, of course we know who our vendors are. You would be so surprised, as we're helping our clients go through this process, how many times vendors pop up that they said, oh gosh, we didn't know we work with them, or we didn't know they have our data. It happens all the time. So a really important question is who are our vendors, and one that's worth diving into. From there, once you know who they are, then we want to understand things like, okay, well, which one of those vendors, or how many of them touch our data? And so, we believe that, not every vendor you do work with or business with is going to have access to personal data or sensitive data. And that's I think pretty obvious, but you need to know the ones that do. And then what specific data do they touch? Is it data that we would consider to be sensitive, or data that we consider to be of high risk if something like a data breach were to occur? The 4th question, which ones are relevant to regulations? So, when you're looking at your scope of vendors, which ones have to comply with a GDPR, a CCPA, NYDFS, you name it, right? These different regulations. And that's really important too, to understand that, because that can help you classify the ones that you really want to dive into a little bit deeper. And then the 5th question is, asking them questions about, how are you protecting our data? What are the safeguards you have in place to ensure that our data is being protected up to our standards, up to the way that we want you to do that? And so when we look at helping our clients with vendor risks, in order to do that, we would recommend some technology because, again, this can feel a little bit like herding cats in a way. Businesses tend to work with many, many vendors, dozens and dozens. And so we would recommend using something like a vendor risk assessment to allow you to, first of all, identify all of your third parties. We recommend sending all third parties through a risk profiling process that really bubbles up the high, medium, and low risk vendors. And it does that by determining which of those vendors have personal data or sensitive data, what regulations apply to them, right? And so you can kind of break them into groups of, which are the medium and the high risk vendors that we want to do a little bit deeper dive with. And so that's a very common approach, is to then really ask more detailed questions of those vendors to make sure that, again, they're managing it in a way that you deem appropriate. And just like everything we've talked about today, Will, we really think that this is an evergreen process. This is not a checkbox item. This is not a, oh, great, we reviewed our vendors in 2020 and we don't have to for another couple of years. We really think that this is something that has to be maintained and updated over and over. And so, I think kind of just in closing from my perspective today, I mean, that's why, for these complex business problems that we discuss, we really think this multi-pronged approach works really well, right? I mean, working with, as we've talked about, working with outside counsel, getting the legal guidance you need, and then leveraging that with some technology to really help you create some efficiencies, lower costs, creates defensibility, all those good things. We've seen a real appetite for that, and one that seems to be working really well for our clients.
Yeah, absolutely, Robert. And I think the issues you identified with vendors is very important for companies to understand that not all vendors are created equal, and often your risk is asymmetrical depending on the particular relationship you have. And so, all in all, you look at the various tools that are out there that they can leverage. I think that they can make a real impact on not only their risk management, but their ability to operationalize and streamline their compliance with respect to data privacy. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. But Robert, again, thank you for your time and for explaining all these great insights to us. And for those of you joining us, you can learn more about our firm's multidisciplinary data privacy and cybersecurity practice at reliclawpllc.com. And you can reach Robert at his contact information there. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you next time.